We're looking at his latest book today. Bart has a knack for putting things out there that turn into controversial issues in the area of the historicity of Christianity, the Bible, and all that sort of thing. His latest book, Did Jesus Exist, is no exception. It's called, subtitled, The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Now, Bart is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Professor of Religious Studies, Bart. So thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back. And I think last time we heard from you on this programme, you were discussing your faith journey with Mike Licona, and before that we had an episode talking about Forged, your book from last year.
Yes.
So you've been very kind to us, coming in so often to
my pleasure.
to talk. I mean, the reason is, of course, that you have family over here, and so you spend a little time each year in the
right.
UK. And
right.
what better way to spend your time than coming in?
Yes, exactly.
But in the course of today's programme, we've set this up in distinction to our normal show format as more a Q&A, where we're just going to be opening up a number of issues that the book raises. And so I've asked for questions on our Facebook and Twitter account from those who would like to ask you questions. Those came in by the bucket load, so we'll see how many of those we can get to in the course of today's programme. And we'll also hear, I've selected just a few excerpts from a programme of a few months ago that I recorded with David Instone Brewer, New Testament scholar in Cambridge, and Bob Price, who's well known as a mythicist in America, a Jesus mythicist. So I think it'd be interesting to hear your response to some of the issues Bob raised in that particular programme as to the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, you've had a bit of a run-in, let's say, with another well-known mythicist, Richard Carrier. But before we get to all of that, just tell us a little bit about the background to this latest book. What made you want to write a book about whether Jesus existed?
Yes, well, I get asked that question a lot. Why would you want to write about whether Jesus existed? And most of the people who've asked me that are people for whom the existence of Jesus is not an issue, and who don't realize that it's an issue for anyone. So why would you try to prove something that everybody already knows? So the background is that several years ago I started getting emails, maybe 2 or 3 emails a week, from people asking me whether I thought Jesus existed, which at the time I thought it was very peculiar, since, as I just said, I thought everybody knew that Jesus existed. Soon I started getting emails from people asking me whether it was true that I did not think Jesus existed. In other words, they had heard that I believed Jesus never existed, which I thought was stranger still. But so I started to look into the matter, and I uncovered this entire world that, as a New Testament scholar, I knew virtually nothing about, the world of the mythicists, the people who claim that Jesus is a myth, that he was actually invented, that he didn't really live. I had known that G.A. Wells had advanced this view, but I didn't know that Wells had any company. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized he had a lot of company, and that there are people who've been writing books saying Jesus didn't exist. These are not books that New Testament scholars have typically read or even know that they exist, but they're out there, and there's a fairly large representation of this view on the internet. And so the more I looked into this, the more I realized that there were people who were being convinced by this perspective that Jesus never existed. And so I thought, well, maybe I better write a book arguing that he did.
Very interesting. I mean, what's interesting about this is that it's kind of put you in a strange position of being between two camps, because obviously the book that you first came into the limelight for, as it were, misquoting Jesus, was obviously something that a lot of Christians had a big problem with and were very worried about. And we obviously, the first time I featured you on this program, you were doing a debate on the thesis of that book, which is that, you know, there are certain issues to do with textual criticism and the transmission of the manuscripts that make it difficult to know what Jesus said in particular instances. But that aside, you're now almost have been kind of now the enemy of the other side, as it were, the atheists who are very angry with you for writing a book supporting the existence of Jesus, even if you don't obviously, you obviously don't hold any evangelical view on, all the aspects of Jesus' life. So well, a lot of people actually asked a similar question when they knew that I was having you on. Blake asks, were you expecting the level of hostility you've had from the atheist community writing a book in defense of the historical Jesus?
Well, no. In fact, I wasn't expecting it. You know, the thing is that as a historian, I don't really take sides on issues. I simply try to paint out what I think happened historically, and so I don't try to write a book in order to promote a Christian cause or to attack a Christian cause. I write books that deal with what I think are the historical realities of early Christianity. And so a book like Misquoting Jesus did get some people upset, but it was based on factual historical information. And even most of my critics agreed with the factual information. They didn't like the tone that I had in the book. Was the most common complaint. And so then when I write this book on Did Jesus Exist, the people who've been cheering me on from the sidelines, the atheists and agnostics, all of a sudden are really incensed, and even more incensed than my evangelical friends were incensed with Misquoting Jesus. And so I guess it's a good thing if you're not approved by everybody all the time, and it appears that I'm not.
I mean, Peter asks, why are so many atheists trying to argue that Jesus didn't exist? Why don't they just accept the historical case and use different arguments if they want to discredit Christianity? Yes,
well, that's a really good question, and it's one that I wrestled with when I was writing my book. One thing to say is that I don't think the typical atheist or the typical agnostic disbelieves that Jesus existed. I think most atheists and most agnostics actually think there was a Jesus, but they certainly don't think that he was the Son of God or that he was raised from the dead. And so I don't think it would be fair to characterize this as the atheist position, the mythicist view. But there are atheists who take the mythicist view, and one of the questions that I wanted to wrestle with was, why is that? What's really driving this mythicist agenda? And I don't have firm evidence about this. I just have an educated guess. And I lay it out in the final chapter of my book. My guess is this, that the people who are claiming that Jesus didn't exist not only are atheists, they also are people who think that religion, especially organized religion, is a major problem. They look at all the harm that's been done in the name of Christ. They look at crusades and inquisitions and oppression in the United States. The Bible was used to justify slavery. It's still used to justify racism and sexism and opposition to basically anybody you don't like. People use the Bible. So I think what's happened is that these people who see religion as a problem have decided to attack religion, and the way to attack the religion they most know about, which is Christianity, which is the religion of their culture, is to claim that in fact Christianity is rooted in a fairy tale, that it's completely a myth, and that by saying that Christianity has no firm historical basis, they can therefore attack Christianity as something that's simply made up in order to oppress people. And so that I think that's the strategy, and so I think that's why I think why most of the mythicists are opposed to the idea that Jesus existed. The other reason for some mythicists, not so much the serious academic ones, but the ones who write the more popular books, is because if they say Jesus didn't exist, they'll sell more books. so if you write a book saying Jesus did exist, nobody's going to really sit up and take notice. But
well, yeah, I mean. They've taken notice of your book, though,
yes,
Bart, and I think it is partly because people considered you an ally, as you said. So some, let's say, types of atheists, and we're not labelling all atheists in this way by any means, but some types of atheists thought we have an ally, but now I don't think you're going to be invited necessarily to Skepticon any longer to sort of present the.
Yeah, I don't know about that. You know, the thing is that my other books have all presupposed that Jesus existed. I mean, all of the books that the atheist and agnostic crowd, the humanists, have cheered on from the sidelines are books in which it's quite clearly presupposed there was a man Jesus. And so for me now to come out and say why I think there was a man Jesus, it doesn't make sense to me. They should be attacking
It's
that.
strange for you that they suddenly feel offended by that. I subjected myself last night in preparation for today. I slightly wish I hadn't, to a YouTube version of a DVD called "The God Who Wasn't There." I don't know if you've come across that.
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother watching.
Okay.
It's a very badly made film, but I mean, it essentially brought over what are very often sort of repeated in the popular literature, things about the origins of where Jesus came from, not least pagan myths from the past that they believe all point to this Jesus character that all symbolize that. I mean, maybe one of the people who, though, is doing this on a serious level is Richard Carrier. Now, he is popular again in the sort of popular atheist circles, but he does have a background in classics and history, as you discovered, having been criticised for not mentioning both of those qualifications.
Actually, I did mention both of them, but he what I think I said was that his PhD was in classics, and he took real umbrage at that because he said my degree is not just in classics; it's in ancient history.
Well, anyway, a lot of people were really interested to know what he would make of your book, because he is probably the foremost mythicist out there, with some academic credibility, and so he, as you know, ripped into your book in a big way when it came out. He published this long review, and I'm just going to read the opening paragraph here, where he says, having completed and fully annotated Ehrman's new book, Did Jesus Exist?, I can officially say it is filled with factual errors, logical fallacies, and badly worded arguments. Moreover, it completely fails at its one explicit task to effectively critique the arguments for Jesus being a mythical person. Lousy with errors and failing even at the one useful thing it could have done, this is not a book I can recommend. And it gets worse. But anyway,
it gets much worse.
You responded, obviously, on your blog to this, and you sort of did a point-by-point response to at least some of the issues he raises. Now, I think as much as anything, I've got the feeling from you that you're a bit disappointed with the way this conversation's being carried out. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's been a lot more name-calling than it has been substance. And the substance hasn't been very substantial, in my opinion. I think Carrier's review was, it was extremely vitriolic, and it wasn't conducted in what would normally be considered a scholarly mode. And I don't know why he chose to take that kind of approach. As opposed to what would happen in a scholarly review, which would be that you would evaluate the points point by point, and you wouldn't say things like, I can officially say that this book is crap. So that isn't scholarly discourse. And so why he didn't want to engage with me on a scholarly level, I'm not sure. But I don't think it really promoted dialogue. To the point where I'm actually not that interested in having dialogue with
do you feel that Carrier's obviously very strongly held atheism and dislike of religion has perhaps created a sort of response that might explain this?
I don't know. I don't know much about him personally. I've never met him personally. We've had some correspondence before he wrote this strident review. We haven't had any correspondence since then, so I don't know anything really about him, about his religious views or his anti-religious views personally. But there is a level of emotional response in a review like this, which suggests that there's something more going on than an interest in historical scholarship, because people who are really interested purely in historical issues don't write like this.
Let's talk about some of the issues he does bring up, and we're only going to get to a couple because I want to get back to some of the questions that came in as well. But he accuses you of sloppy scholarship at various points in the book. Maybe we could talk about the pilot error is one that comes up, and he says you misattribute you explain what the issue was that he picked out in this instance.
Yeah, so this is a typical kind of argument that he makes in his review, which is dealing with a very minor point that has nothing to do with the issue. So the issue, the reason I talk about Pontius Pilate, the thing he's going to attack, has to do with a reference in the Roman historian Tacitus, who gives one of our early references to Jesus outside of Christian sources. So Tacitus is an early 2nd century Roman historian who mentions Jesus. And in the context of talking about Jesus, in this brief reference, he mentions that he was executed by the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. And in my discussion of this, I wanted to show that probably this is a historical reference, that Tacitus actually knew something about the historical Jesus. But I also said that he obviously had not done research in the archives of Rome or anything like that about this, because when he identified Pontius Pilate as the procurator of Judea, he wasn't that kind of governor. He wasn't the procurator. He was actually a prefect. And we know this because there was an inscription discovered in Caesarea Maritima in the 1960s, which had been put up. This inscription had been put up in honor of Pontius Pilate, and it named him as a prefect rather than as a procurator. Well, it's a different kind of governor. So, I didn't want to get too technical in the book, or here. I mean, I'm happy to get technical if you want me to about what the difference is. But procurators and prefects are two different kinds of Roman governors. So that was my point.
Yeah.
So
it was a kind of a sub issue.
It was a sub issue. It was like irrelevant to anything other than saying that it was actually a point that would be supporting a view that Carrier would want to promote, which is that Tacitus actually hadn't done any research. He had just heard about this. So what Carrier attacked me for was being so ignorant as to think that procurators and prefects were two different kinds of governors. That didn't I know that all the current research said that procurators could be prefects, and so that showed that I was a sloppy historian.
You then went and asked a colleague of yours who actually confirmed what you feel is satisfactory.
Yeah, so when I read that, I was surprised, and I'm happy to be corrected if I make a mistake. I mean, I'm a historian. I want to get history right, and so I had never heard that procurators could be prefects, and so I have a colleague at UNC. At my school, who's one of the international authorities on Roman imperial history. His expertise is on the role of the Roman Senate in the early and later empire. And he's a very famous Roman historian. And so I asked him. I said, Is that true, that prefects and procurators were the same? And he wrote back and he said, well, it's actually complicated, but not really. And he gave me this reference where which stated quite clearly that in fact prefects and procurators were two different kinds of governors, which is what I thought.
I mean, let's go to some of these questions because people are interested in knowing whether this very long-running review did change your mind at any degree. So, for instance, John Rumsey says, since you wrote the book, has an argument been presented to you that's made you waver on its conclusions? Daniel says, do you consider any of Richard Carrier's points as particularly challenging on your stance on the historical Jesus? I mean, was there anything in there that did make you think, oh, maybe Jesus didn't really exist?
No. I mean, he didn't. In his response, he didn't really mount any argument that Jesus didn't exist. He wanted to attack me for thinking that prefects and procurators couldn't be the same thing. I mean, it was at that kind of level. I don't. Carrier is writing a book right now in which he's going to lay out more systematically his position, and so nothing that he said so far is particularly convincing to me. So there's nothing in there.
What for those who kind of you would just give, say, one simple piece of evidence that you think is a plain reading shows that Jesus did exist? What would you point to as the evidence?
Well. Right, so it's complicated because to actually make the case, you have to write a full-length book.
Sure.
So that's what I did because it isn't just a thing. I mean, no. There are lots of things, but here's one thing.
Okay.
One thing is that we don't have any writings from anybody who was one of Jesus' disciples, in my opinion. This is debated. Of course, evangelical scholars might say that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, or that John wrote the Gospel of John, and so those are eyewitnesses. Most critical scholars don't think so. So I don't count that evidence. But what we do have, which is pretty close to that, is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was a contemporary of Jesus who didn't know Jesus, but Paul did know Jesus' brother, James, and Jesus' closest disciple, Cephas. And Paul was personally acquainted with them. He tells us about them. And so what I say in my book is that, I mean, this is just one small piece of evidence, but if Jesus didn't exist, you would think that his brother would know about it. And so, because his brother, we have somebody who knew his brother. And so I think that's just one little piece of evidence.
Interesting stuff. Well, if you want to get in touch on today's program, we're looking at Bart Ehrman's new book, Did Jesus Exist? He's come in for criticism, this time from atheists, on his defence of the historical Jesus. And so if you want to comment on this, then why not drop me an email, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Don't forget this programme, along with many others, available at the show website, premier.org.uk/unbelievable. I'll post up some links to previous programmes that Bart has joined me on as well, discussing other books that he's put out in the last few years. So do get in touch, and don't forget we're also available on Twitter and Facebook. @UnbelievableJB is the Twitter handle.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Just in the last moments of this section of the programme, Bart, just going to play you a section of a show I recorded a few months ago with Bob Price, who's another mythicist, and he was in conversation on this show with David Instone Brewer, as I mentioned. And here's Bob just in the opening of the show, really, talking about his perspective as a mythicist.
And I actually came to the point of embracing a view I once thought was as much of a crank view as Bart Ehrman portrays it in his new book, Did Jesus Exist?, where he attacks me and a bunch of others, namely that Jesus very likely did not exist at all, that if he had, there's no way of recovering what he may have been like, if there was a Jesus, he is retreated behind the stained glass curtain, and barring some new discovery, we can never know whether there was one or not. I don't say as a dogma we know there wasn't, that'd be ludicrous. All historical hypotheses are tentative and seek correction, but I don't think really any of it is very likely to be historically accurate.
Okay, there you go. That was what Bob Price had to say on the issue. He obviously feels that you've really, gone for the mythicists, and in an unfair way, that you haven't taken seriously the academic nature of what they're seeking to do. Well,
yeah, I mean, in his comment, of course, he doesn't give any reasons for thinking what he thinks, and so it's a little bit hard to respond to that. When he says that there's no way of recovering what Jesus was really like, that is his opinion. It's an opinion that's not shared by everybody else who works in this field. Virtually everybody that I know of thinks not only did Jesus exist, but we can say some things about him by applying rather rigorous historical criteria to the materials we have. We in fact can say some things about what Jesus said and did, and so that's not an unusual position from my point of view. I mean, this is the point of view that virtually everybody in the field has.
There are some who say if you apply this radical skepticism to the existence of Jesus, you'd have difficulty having sufficient evidence for many historical characters of history that we just don't find controversial.
Well, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, we have far more evidence about Jesus than we have for almost anybody in the ancient world. I mean, there are a few exceptions. You know, we know more about Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus or other great political leaders just because they were so important. And some important figures like Cicero or Julius Caesar left us writings, and Jesus didn't leave us any writings. But if you simply look at people who are at Jesus' socioeconomic status, so sort of a lower class peasant in a rural part of the empire, I don't think there's anybody from the ancient world that even comes close to the amount of evidence we have for Jesus for anyone else.
Well, we're going to pick this up again in the next part of today's programme. We'll maybe play a bit more from Bob Price and go to some of the arguments he actually did present in that programme against the existence of a historical Jesus. But we're talking today particularly on the issue of did Jesus exist? Bart Ehrman, my guest today. He's normally here, as it were, in the critical position, but today sort of roles reverse somewhat as he defends the historical Jesus against those who say Jesus never existed. That was what his latest book did, and quite the controversy it caused too in the atheist blogosphere. Well, we're going to continuing to put some of your questions to Bart and hearing some more of his responses in a moment's time here on the show that aims to get you thinking unbelievable.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to Unbelievable. It's Saturday afternoon, time of the week when we try and engage the grey matter, get you thinking through issues philosophical, historical, biblical. And today we have noted New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman in the studio. Rather different to normal. We're not putting Bart up against another candidate, as it were. We're rather doing it more as a Q&A session, and we're hearing some of your thoughts, some of your questions to Bart, both from Christians and atheists who listen to this programme. And Bart's got himself into a bit of controversy with the atheist community with his latest book, Did Jesus Exist? Because whereas normally Bart is seen as being firmly positioned on the sceptical side as regards the evidence for Christianity, in this book he actually supports the thesis that Jesus was at the very least a historical person, whether or not you agree with his claims to divinity and all the rest of it. Well, that has created, as we were mentioning in the first part, Bart, some antipathy towards you from people like mythicists like Richard Carrier, but Bob Price, who is at least a little bit more jovial in the way he conducts himself.
Yes, well, that wouldn't take much.
He obviously disagrees, though, with your conclusions, and we heard in that part, at least Bob spelling out that he is a mythicist. Well, here's just another small segment of the show I recorded with Bob and David Instone Brewer. This was contra David Instone Brewer's suggestion that the cross was, as it were, a criterion of embarrassment for Christians in the early church, being such a shameful form of execution for a Jewish person, and that this was a good reason to believe that this really was a historical fact of the account of Jesus' life. Why would you put that into your made-up record of a Jewish Messiah figure, essentially? Here's Bob's response to that, essentially saying that, well, this was just part of a whole sort of hero story that they were essentially drawing on from others as well.
Not necessarily. The Spartacus and his men were great heroes. There are popular novels of the period where, from the 2nd century BC and earlier on into the next few centuries, where heroes are condemned to the cross, actually crucified, but escape it almost miraculously. And so I don't think that it's necessarily any kind. I mean, it's like the darkness before the dawn. The story doesn't end with a crucifixion. It's like, can he get out of this? And he does. It's similar to the skepticism element of a miracle story. It has the function of heightening the victory at the end, so it would make sense as a literary invention, and we do have other known literary inventions that have the same sort of thing, crucifixions and so on, momentary shame but then vindication.
So there you go, a literary invention, essentially, the crucifixion.
Right. Well, it would take probably an entire chapter to show the problems with this view, but it's problematic up and down the line. And to begin with, when Bob wants to argue that in the Greek novels we have instances, fictional instances of heroes getting crucified, I have no clue what he's talking about, and I think he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. We have 5 Greek novels from the ancient world, and I teach these novels to my graduate students. They read them. There is no fictional character who gets crucified in these novels and then miraculously escapes. And so I don't know what he's referring to there. The idea that you would make up the idea of a hero who gets crucified, that isn't really the argument that we're dealing with the historical Jesus. The question with the historical Jesus is not whether a hero would get crucified, it's whether a Messiah would get crucified. The early Christians said Jesus was the Messiah, and they said he got crucified. The problem with that is that we don't have any record of any Jew prior to Christianity who thought that the Messiah was going to get crucified. We have lots of records of what Jews thought Messiah was going to be, and they had a wide variety of opinions about what the Messiah would be. He might be a great political leader like King David, a warrior king, or he might be a great mighty priest, as was believed on by the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. He might be a heavenly cosmic judge of the earth who would come to destroy the forces of evil. All of these are various ways of looking at the Messiah in early Judaism. In no reference to the Messiah in early Judaism is there a reference to him being crucified. So the idea that the Christians would make up the idea that this crucified man was the Messiah just doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is that they knew Jesus got crucified and they believed he was the Messiah, so they came up with the idea of a crucified Messiah.
So in a sense, you would agree with the idea that this would be too odd, embarrassing a story to put in if you were trying to convince people of a Messiah figure in the Jewish tradition, which is essentially the point that David Instone Brewer was making with that this fulfilled this sort of embarrassment criteria.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. If you wanted to make up a Messiah, you wouldn't make up a crucified Messiah. You'd make up a Messiah who's ruling as the king in Jerusalem, or who was a mighty priest who was going to lead the people. But you wouldn't make up a crucified Messiah.
A few people, though, you've mentioned the fact that you teach various aspects of history to your students. For some reason, a couple of the atheist users of my Facebook group wanted specifically to ask you, are you a historian? And Neil reiterates that. He says, are you a historian would be high on my list of questions. Make sure it's not a fob off like I'm a historian of the New Testament or something like that, though. There seems to be a question mark over, I don't know whether this is something going back to the Richard Carrier thing, whether you have the credentials to make statements about the history of this era.
Well, that's a very strange question. So how does one answer that? I mean, it's kind of like asking, is Lee Westwood a golfer? I mean, it's what he does for a living. And so history is what I do for a living. This is the courses I teach at the University of North Carolina, both my undergraduate courses and my PhD courses, are courses on the history of Christianity in the first 3 or 4 centuries. The books that I write are books about the history of early Christianity. The speeches I give around the country are about the history of early Christianity. So this is what I do for a living. So yes, I think I am a historian.
I mean, part of the whole aspect of what you're doing in the book is both addressing the negative arguments of the mythicists. So when they criticize certain sources as being valid or whatever, when we're talking about extra biblical witnesses to Jesus and that kind of thing. But there's also, in a sense, the positive case they make of how would this myth have arisen, and so what is often put forward at that point is that Jesus was a kind of amalgamation of a number of pagan stories, God sort of incarnations, and that sort of thing. Let's talk a little bit about that, and maybe just to help us into this again, we could play just a segment from Bob Price again on that show he recorded with David Instone Brewer. They were at this point talking about the resurrection story, and Bob was making the case that, well, this is another example of myths kind of, being sort of used from other pagan religions. Here's what he had to say about that in regard to whether this could be compared to the Osiris religion.
The Osiris religion, familiar to Jews from long, long ago. You can even see evidence of it in the Joseph and his brethren stories. Here you have the resurrected one, Osiris, because Isis searched for the body, found it, anointed it with oil, and thus raised it from the dead. And that now, if Jesus, the Christ, the anointed one, originally meant the resurrected one in a context like that, as I think it did, then trying to square him with the Davidic Jewish Messiah is a later attempt to assimilate this into more Pharisaic-type Judaism. And it's certainly that's a big issue with the fact that Jesus doesn't look much like a Davidic Messiah in any other way, so it's not surprising there might be other feeds.
So he's saying there are other tributaries that we have to look at when it comes to where this story of Jesus came from, and the Osiris religion seems to bear a lot of similarities to the story they told of Jesus, and so this is a perfectly valid way of seeing how this myth would have developed.
Right. Well, so this is problematic up and down the line again. I don't know where Bob's getting his information about the Osiris religion, but it doesn't seem to be from the ancient sources. Maybe he's read someplace that it's like Jesus. But in fact, the Osiris myth is not like Jesus. He wants to, and I'll show that in a second, but the first thing is to say that Jews were familiar with the Osiris myth. I would like Bob to give a single reference from any Jew living anywhere within 200 years of Jesus who mentions the Osiris myth.
I mean, he does say, just in that clip, Ezekiel has some sort of...
No, he says the Joseph story.
Okay, the Joseph story.
Joseph's story has nothing to do with the Osiris myth. so I don't know what he's talking about there either. I mean, we could talk about the details. But let me talk about the specific thing he wants to argue, which is that the resurrection of Jesus is like the resurrection of Osiris. All you have to do is read the ancient sources on Osiris. The most famous one is Plutarch, who has a very lengthy essay on Isis and Osiris. And when you read the essay, it's true that Osiris gets killed. What is not true is that he gets raised from the dead. He doesn't get raised from the dead. When Jesus gets raised from the dead, his body comes back to life, and he comes out of the tomb and he ascends to heaven. Osiris stayed dead. His body was wasn't embalmed. It was entombed, and there were various places, according to Plutarch, where different locales argued that his body was entombed, and they built shrines to this dead body. The body stayed dead. Now, Osiris himself, his soul lived on in the underworld. He became the king of the underworld. But his body didn't come back to life. And so he wasn't resurrected from the dead. His body stayed dead. That's very different from the Christian doctrine of the resurrection, which is that Jesus' body actually came back from the dead. So where did the Christians get that idea from? They certainly didn't get it from Osiris, because that's not what happened to Osiris.
I mean, listening to you now, someone just tuning in might be mistaken for thinking, oh, Justin's got another Christian apologist on the show this week.
No, you've got a historian on your show. And I, that's the thing. I'm not taking side. I'm not trying to argue for or against a Christian position. I'm simply stating what historians know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for you, this is the what you have to conclude on this. I mean, obviously you don't, by that same token, believe yourself in the resurrection as a fact of history, and we need to be clear about that. Yeah. That's not where you stand, and we've done debates between yourself and Mike Licona on that whole area. So I'll direct people to that if they want an in-depth view on where you do stand on what the evidence is for and against that.
I don't think Jesus was raised from the dead, but I also don't think that the belief about Jesus rising from the dead is based on the Osiris myth.
Right. So that, just to be clear on that, and if you do want to go and hear a very interesting debate, as I say, do go to the website where you can. I'll post a link with this programme at premier.org.uk/unbelievable to Bart's interaction with Christian New Testament historian Mike Licona on whether Jesus really did rise from the dead. But let's go to some more of these questions, because I know that this was part of your ding-dong with Richard Carrier when it came to the dying and rising God stories. What do you feel is lacking in his explanation of why the Jesus story closely follows the dying and rising God stories. Is it just that you don't think, even if there were parallels, that these people writing the story would have had access to those stories? That would have influenced them?
Well, that's part of it, but there are two issues involved. What the typical mythicist argues, and again, I'm not sure what Carrier is going to argue because his book isn't out yet, so I'm not sure exactly what he's going to argue. But what typically gets argued by the mythicists is that there was a common motif in pagan religions of a God who dies and then is raised from the dead, and that Jesus was invented as a Jewish version of that myth. What I argue in my book is that view is wrong for two major reasons that are both pretty damning. One is that we don't have evidence that pagans believed in a dying, rising God at all. And secondly, Jesus wasn't invented as a dying, rising God because the earliest Christians didn't think he was God. That was a later development within Christianity. So with respect to the pagan myths, there simply is no plausible parallel to the idea of a divine being who dies and is raised bodily, physically from the dead. You just don't have any instances of dying, rising gods. This idea of a dying, rising God started being made popular by a very famous author in the early 20th century named Fraser, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough, where he argued that it was typical in pagan religions to have these dying, rising gods. More recent scholarship over the last 20 years has shown that in fact that's bogus, that in fact there are not instances of this. And if you actually press a mythicist to give you an example, they give you examples like Bob Price just gave of Osiris, which is definitely not a case of somebody being raised from the dead. So there's that problem. And the other problem then is that the one that your audience won't be as comfortable with is my claim that the earliest Christians didn't think Jesus was God. They eventually came to say Jesus was God, but it's not what the earliest followers said, the ones who said that he got raised from the dead.
Okay, well, we're not have time to go into that, but let's bring it back to other objections that people sometimes raise to the historical Jesus, and that often focuses around the writings outside of the New Testament. You've already mentioned Tacitus referenced Jesus. Josephus is often brought in as a contemporary historian of the time who talked about Jesus' followers, talked about Jesus to some extent. Now, you'll have to give a bit of background to this for those who just don't know, including me, the exact story here. But Caspars and Steve Miller both ask similar questions. Caspars wants to know, what is Bart's opinion on the literary Greek of the Testimonium Flavianum vis-a-vis the claim that it was an interpolation? So we'll get you to translate that for us in a moment. Steve Miller says, could you ask Bart on what basis he regards some, but not all, of Josephus's, again, Testimonium Flavianum as an interpolation? If he's sure the original text has been tampered with, how can he consider any of the references to Jesus as being reliable? So talk us first of all through what this Josephus's Testimonium Flavianum is and why it supports or doesn't support the existence of Jesus.
Right. So the Testimonium Flavianum, Flavius Josephus was a first century Jewish historian who wrote a number of books near the end of the first century, including a 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews, which was a book that traced the history of the Jewish people all the way from Adam and Eve up to his own day in 20 volumes. And in these 20 volumes, he, of course, talks about a lot of different Jews, especially near his own time. He mentions Jesus in two passages in the book The Antiquities. One of these passages is called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius Josephus, in which he devotes about a paragraph to Jesus, in which he says some interesting things about Jesus. He says, at this time there lived a man, if you can call him a man, for he was the Messiah. And he goes on to describe that Jesus was a teacher. He had followers among both Jews and non-Jews, that he did spectacular deeds, but that Pontius Pilate ordered him to be crucified, and he was executed by Pilate. And then he says, but then he was raised on the third day from the dead in fulfillment of the Scriptures. So this passage has long been cited by Christians as evidence that Jesus must have existed, because the first century Jewish historian, who is the best historian we have from the period, actually talks about it. Historians have discussed this passage endlessly because of its significance. One thing that seems relatively certain to just about everyone is that there's no way that Josephus, the Jewish historian, actually thought that Jesus was the Messiah who got raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because we actually have an autobiography from Josephus, and so we know about his life, and he never became a Christian. And so these Christian comments in the testimony are widely thought to be interpolations into the testimony.
By an interpolation, you mean someone came along later and inserted a little bit extra text, basically.
Right.
And the text they inserted would have been the bit about, and he was the Messiah and raised from the dead 3 days later.
The reason for thinking this, there's actually a reason for thinking this, which is Josephus was viewed throughout Jewish history, and is still viewed among Jews as being a traitor to the Jewish cause. For reasons I can go into if you really want me to. But even today, if you go to Israel and have an Israeli tour guide, they'll talk about Josephus, but they are not very kind toward him because they think of him as a turncoat. Josephus's writings were not copied through the Middle Ages by Jews. They were copied by Christians who wanted to preserve his writings for posterity. And so what is thought is that a Christian who copied this passage whomped it up a bit by adding a few lines to make it clear that he's talking about Jesus, the Messiah who got raised from the dead.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so historians who have treated this passage have treated it gingerly. The consensus view among historians is that this passage was originally written by Josephus, but a few bits were thrown in by this Christian scribe. So the mythicists want to argue that the whole thing is in fact interpolated.
Okay, so basically, well, if one bit got interpolated, couldn't the whole passage, the whole paragraph be a fabrication?
Right. And of course historians have looked at that possibility and considered it. What is usually thought is that if you take out these Christian parts, just these few words here and there, that the rest of it reads very much like Josephus. It sounds like something Josephus would have said. The style is like Josephus, and so this probably is something that Josephus actually said. The mythicists want to say, no, it was all completely inserted into Josephus. My view is that if Christians wanted to insert a passage about Jesus into Josephus, it would be much more, much longer and much more flowery than this passage. This is really
this is very bare bones, and so if they were going to create something, why not go the whole hog
they would
and
really
write
womp
a
it
chapter?
up. They would really, that's right. They even devote a chapter to Jesus, and but that isn't what you get. You just get this little brief. And the other thing is, you get another reference to Jesus in Book 18 of the Antiquities, which mentions James, the brother of the man Jesus who is called the Messiah. So this is just a completely off-the-cuff reference to Jesus that presupposes that the audience knows who he's talking about.
Right.
And so again, it's not the way that Christian scribes typically insert their beliefs into a passage.
So, some critics, when I've spoken to them about this, have said, well, okay, maybe Josephus did write this down, okay, but he didn't know Jesus, he was getting this all secondhand from other people.
Yeah.
Is that a criticism of the...
Well, no, I think that's true. I mean, he didn't know Jesus. I mean, he was born after Jesus had died, so obviously he didn't know Jesus. So this is not first-hand information. This is second-hand information. But the thing is, if you get lots and lots of second-hand information, it goes back to something. And so it's a small piece of the puzzle. It's not an enormous piece of the puzzle. It's a small piece of the puzzle, but you need all the pieces in order to put the puzzle together.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for answering that question from Stephen Kaspars. Maybe just as we're just closing in on the end of this section of the programme, Harmony, Christian this time, writing, says, how do you explain the origins of Christianity as an exploding world religion and the willingness of Jewish converts to lay their lives down for a Messiah who didn't meet their expectations of political glory and who was crucified? As has been stated in other debates, acolytes of other messiahs either went home or found a different leader. Why did they claim his resurrection and lay down their lives for him if it didn't happen? So this is moving, I suppose, into a different kind of debate, the one I referenced earlier about obviously Harmony believes that this is evidence for them believing in a physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, you've said, okay, they believed Jesus was resurrected, but presumably do you believe, in that sense, their belief in the resurrection was the reason for the explosion of the early Christian church?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say the early church exploded. I mean, it's not that the Roman Empire converted, 5 years after Jesus died. It took a very long time. The Christian movement grew at a rate, we know this statistically. Statistically, the early church grew at a rate of about 40% every decade. So every 10 years, there were 40% more Christians. And it's not true that everybody laid down and died for Jesus. It's not true, as is sometimes said, that all the disciples were martyred for their faith. We don't know what happened to most of the disciples. We have no historical record, and so we don't know. We do know that some people were persecuted for being Christian. Some people died for being Christian, and they died because, yes, they believed that Jesus got raised from the dead. I think that that's an absolute historical datum, that they believed Jesus was raised from the dead. Mm-hmm. That's not relevant to the question of whether he was raised from the dead. It simply means they believed he was raised. People believe all sorts of things, and the early Christians did believe he got raised from the dead. And because they believed he got raised from the dead, they thought that the message that Jesus preached was true, and that to be right in the eyes of God, you had to accept Jesus' message, and they were willing to die for that.
Okay. Probably we don't have time to go into that sub-question then, the additional question of whether what they believed to be true really was true. And again, I'd refer you to the debate you did with Mike Licona on that front. So we're going to take a quick break now, and we'll just be finishing up this discussion, Q&A with Bart Ehrman, my guest on today's show, as we take some of your questions to him that you've been posting up on the Facebook page and Facebook group of Unbelievable, and we'll get to one or two more of those in the last section of today's programme. If you want to get hold of Bart's book, Did Jesus Exist? I'm posting a link to it with the podcast of this programme, so go and check that out, premier.org.uk/unbelievable, and see for yourself what all the fuss is about. And I'm sure if you type it into Google, you'll equally be able to come across all the toings and froings on the historical atheist Christian blogs over the furore that it created back in April when it was first published. We're going to be back in a moment's time, finishing up today's programme, looking at the question of whether there was a historical argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Welcome back to the final part of Unbelievable this Saturday afternoon. Don't forget you can find us online at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Links to the discussion that's been going on today's programme there. You can also find a link to the Atheist Prayer Experiment, and I'm going to be reading out a couple of emails from people who have been interested to comment on that or even to take part. That's running from the middle of September through to October. And if you want to find out more about it, we've put up a web page where you can get more information. If you're an atheist listening today and you'd like to find out more about the Atheist Prayer Experiment and the academic paper that it's based on, then do go to premier.org.uk/atheist prayer experiment. Okay, so next week on the show we do atheism, particularly because we've got Alom Shahar joining me. Alom is an atheist, formerly from a Muslim background. Well, he's written the Young Atheist's Handbook, and in it he really tells his story of journeying towards atheism. He's now a physics teacher in London, but he's going to be having a conversation with Tom Price. Tom is a tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. His story is actually going from atheism to Christianity, so rather the reverse of Alom's, and I think they're going to have a fascinating discussion on Alom's new book this time next week, and so do hope you can tune in for that, or catch the podcast at premier.org.uk/unbelievable.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Well, just finishing up our programme. Today I've been interviewing Bart Ehrman about his latest book, Did Jesus Exist?, in which he lays out the historical arguments for Jesus of Nazareth against the popular mythicists of today. And we've already been talking about the responses to people like Bob Price and Richard Carrier in the books and the articles and online things they've done, suggesting that Jesus was just a fabrication, if you like, of the early church in some way. We've got a final question that maybe I'll chuck your way before we finish up here. It's somewhat personal, this one, so I hope you don't mind this, Bart. But Aaron asks, when it comes to your own loss of faith, did the textual evidence for Jesus' existence or non-existence play a role in that? You know, we've done a programme charting that journey that you took. I mean, did the textual evidence for Jesus' existence have any kind of bearing on that?
Yeah, well, the short answer is no. My scholarship on the New Testament and early Christianity did affect my faith. It moved me from being a committed evangelical Christian who believed that the Bible was the infallible Word of God to understanding the Bible to be a very historical book, and that the stories about Jesus had probably been changed over time, and that we didn't really know with precise detail everything about Jesus. It did change my view about the Bible. I left the faith not because of my scholarship, though, but because of the problem of suffering, which is something I think we've talked about before. And it had really nothing to do with whether the Bible was inspired or whether we knew about the historical Jesus.
I mean, he follows it up, but I think you've probably answered it anyway. Would it be possible for your faith to be restored by the discovery of some super awesome, nearly original, flawless manuscript?
Oh, well, no, it's an interesting question, and the answer is no, because my problem with the faith is not that we don't have the original manuscripts. I mean, we don't have the original manuscripts. Well, suppose the original manuscript of the Gospel of John was discovered. That'd be great. I'd love it as a historian, but it's not going to affect whether I believe in the Gospel of John or not. All that would do would be, it would show us that we know for certain what John actually wrote. Whether what he wrote is true or not would be another question.
Because ultimately that is a completely different question. It's a philosophical issue that you have with God that eventually put the lid on your
That's right.
your Christian faith. Just going to that, I know that earlier in the year you had a debate with Dan Wallace talking about the Bible, but he used that as an opportunity to tell us about a new manuscript that's been discovered of the Gospel of Mark.
Well, no, the frustrating thing is he used it as an opportunity not to tell us about this manuscript.
Well,
he said it existed, but he wouldn't tell us anything about it. And so, which I find very hard to understand why you I guess it's to score a debating point.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we've got a little bit more on this. It seems like, on the face of it, quite an interesting discovery, what potentially is the earliest fragments of Mark to have been discovered, dating it as early as we've ever had confirmation of. For you, does that change the game at all in terms of the evidence for Jesus or anything?
No. I mean, if there are fragments of Mark that are discovered that are first century, and I think the jury's out. I don't know who dated these things. I don't know what grounds.
We're still waiting, obviously, for the official publication on all this. But
yeah, and Dan won't tell us anything until then. So I don't know. But even if you discovered the original Gospel of Mark
in pristine form,
even if you found the entire thing in pristine form, that would be great. That'd be important, but it wouldn't change my views about anything that I can think of. In fact, I don't know whose views it would change. The only person whose views would change is if you could definitively date the Gospel of Mark, say, to the year 70 based on this, or the year 65 based on the original. The only views it would change is somebody who thought that the Gospel of Mark was written in the year 120. Well, I don't know anybody who thinks the Gospel of Mark was written in the year 120. We all think it was written 65 or 70.
Yeah, I suppose it might have an implication if you got it really early that before 70 AD.
That would be good.
Jesus did actually predict the fall of the temple and
no, it wouldn't. It wouldn't show that. No, it wouldn't show that. Suppose you have a gospel that appeared, that the autograph, the original, was written in the year 50, and we now have this thing in the year 50, and Jesus predicts that the temple is going to be destroyed. Well, there were lots of people who predicted the temple was going to be destroyed. And so would it show that Jesus predicted that? Yes, it would show that Jesus predicted it. Would it show that he was really raised from the dead? No, it wouldn't show he was raised from the dead.
Well, it's been really fun, very interesting talking to you about this book, Bart, and just interesting to see all the different points of view that it's obviously brought forth, and seeing you obviously straddling somewhere in the middle the two extremes that sometimes exist on these issues. But thank you for coming in to talk about it today.